The Sunday family lunch in the grand dining room of the Upper East Side mansion was supposed to be just another afternoon of polite smiles and disguised humiliations. Claire had expected to sit quietly, as she always did, enduring the subtle barbs from her mother-in-law, Lucille, while her husband, Ryan, remained conveniently oblivious. But then Ryan walked through the heavy mahogany doors with Victoria, his mistress, and presented her as the woman who finally matched his elevated world. In front of the entire family, Claire did not scream, she did not cry, and she certainly did not beg for an explanation. She simply stood up, prepared to leave, and took with her the only invisible pillar that was still keeping that wealthy family from total collapse. "If she is so elegant, then let her save your family today," Claire said, her voice too low to sound like a threat, yet entirely too firm to be mistaken for weakness. The dining room hung in suspended animation for a long second, as if even the crystal chandeliers had understood the gravity of those words before the people below them did. Ryan remained standing near the entryway, his hand resting casually on Victoria's bare back, a handsome and cruel smile frozen on his face, while Lucille gripped her glass of chilled white wine, fully expecting her daughter-in-law to swallow the pain and preserve the family's immaculate appearance. Earlier that afternoon, the lunch had been orchestrated with an aggressive, intimidating perfection. The long table, imported from a renowned European artisan, was covered in pristine white porcelain, discreet arrangements of expensive orchids, and crystal glasses aligned with absolute military precision. Outside the massive windows, the manicured gardens of their New York estate reflected the bright autumn sky, while two silent staff members moved seamlessly between the chef's kitchen and the dining area, serving roasted duck, grilled asparagus, and delicate portions of wild rice. Claire had arrived exactly 20 minutes early, as was her habit, wearing a simple, unadorned navy blue dress with no heavy jewelry and no plunging neckline, refusing to participate in a superficial competition she had never cared to win. Resting quietly inside her leather handbag was a thick beige envelope bearing the seal of a prominent corporate law firm, right next to a smaller folder containing highly confidential banking documents. Ryan had told her this lunch was crucial, that there would be a delicate conversation regarding the family business after dessert was served, but he either did not know or willfully ignored that Claire had also been summoned by the bank to have a conversation of her own. "Could you at least try to smile?" Ryan had muttered to her the moment he entered, even before offering a greeting, while Victoria glided across the Persian rug as if she had owned the place for a decade. The first course was served under a heavy silence that was thick with calculated, tiny cruelties. Lucille leaned forward, ignoring Claire completely, and asked Victoria overly enthusiastic questions about recent modern exhibitions in Chelsea and luxurious weekend getaways to the Hamptons. Victoria answered with heavily rehearsed, breathy sentences, always glancing sideways at Claire, ensuring she dropped little remarks that were anything but innocent, mentioning how Ryan preferred women who knew how to navigate elite social circles without embarrassing anyone. Claire listened to the entire performance without taking a single bite of her meal, her posture perfectly straight. When her cellular phone vibrated persistently inside her purse, she briefly glanced down to see the name Matthew, the senior manager of the investment bank, responsible for the financial restructuring of the family's holding company, flashing on the screen. She chose not to answer, gently pressing the button to silence the device. Ryan noticed the subtle movement and immediately frowned, leaning across the table to scold her. "Not now, Claire. Try to at least be mentally present today," he commanded softly. Claire slowly looked up from her empty plate, her eyes locking onto his. "I am vastly more present than you could ever possibly imagine," she replied. Victoria dramatically placed a manicured hand on Ryan's arm, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear that he should not be so harsh, because some women simply were not born to understand the nuances of high society. It was in that exact moment that Ryan decided to elevate his casual cruelty into a formal, humiliating address. He gently tapped his silver knife against the rim of his crystal water glass, demanding the table's absolute attention, as if he were about to propose a toast to their continued prosperity. "I know that my presence here today with Victoria might cause a degree of discomfort for some," he began, looking at Claire just long enough to inflict pain without appearing entirely vulgar to his audience. But this family must move forward with maturity and grace. Because there are certain individuals who simply match the life we have built, the heavy commitments we carry, and the exclusive environments in which we must routinely operate. Victoria possesses a natural elegance, a social lightness, and a sophisticated posture that quite frankly has been missing from my life for a very long time. Uncle Arthur, sitting near the end of the table, cleared his throat in profound discomfort, while a distant cousin stared intently at her napkin, and Lucille offered no interruption whatsoever. Claire remembered a different table, many years prior, far smaller and distinctly lacking in luxury, back when Ryan did not own expensive watches or employ a private driver, back when he held her hand in a small bakery and confessed that beside her, he felt safe enough to fail without losing love. Claire had believed in that young man so deeply that she had quietly signed massive guarantees, introduced him to powerful investors who trusted her mother's esteemed maiden name, and prevented the holding company's first catastrophic debt from becoming a front-page financial scandal. But sitting there, listening to him praise another woman as adequate, while treating her like obsolete furniture, something fundamental and fragile inside her finally snapped, not with a loud crash, but with a quiet, irreversible release. "Are you quite finished?" Claire asked, her tone entirely devoid of aggression, which seemed to irritate Ryan far more than a screaming match ever would have. "Do not start with your irony," he snapped back. Claire carefully folded her linen napkin and placed it on the table. "It is not irony. I merely wish to know if your speech has concluded." Lucille slammed her wineglass onto the table, demanding that Claire moderate her tone immediately out of respect for the family. Claire looked directly at her mother-in-law and stated that she had been moderating her tone for 8 long years. When Ryan took a step toward her, accusing her of playing the victim, Claire took a deep breath and delivered the sentence that drained all the oxygen from the room, telling them to let the elegant Victoria save them. She then opened her purse, retrieved the thick beige envelope, and placed it next to her plate with a soft, definitive thud that echoed louder than any insult spoken that afternoon. She stood up slowly, her navy blue dress falling perfectly straight over her knees, possessing a profound dignity that no one else in that opulent room had managed to achieve. She slid her gold wedding band off her finger and placed it directly on top of the beige envelope, forcing Uncle Arthur to stare at it with trembling hands. "You will absolutely not leave this table in this manner," Lucille hissed, her face pale with unadulterated fury. Claire looked at the older woman with a sorrow that felt ancient. "Today, especially today, I will." Ryan reached out to grab her wrist, but stopped inches away, perhaps because the look in her eyes warned him that the compliant wife he was so accustomed to interrupting was officially gone. Claire walked out of the dining room without looking back, stepping through the massive front doors just as a sleek silver car pulled up to the driveway. Matthew, the senior banker, stepped out alongside a corporate attorney, looking frantic. He rushed toward the steps, blurting out that they desperately needed Claire's physical signature, as the entire restructuring agreement relied solely on her personal assets and the commitment letter she had drafted using her maiden name. Ryan, who had followed her out, froze completely on the marble steps, the arrogant mask melting off his face as the crushing reality set in. Claire instructed the banker that the meeting was indefinitely suspended, got into her waiting vehicle, and left the shattered family staring at the driveway as the New York afternoon sun beat down on their sudden ruin. The dark vehicle carried Claire away from the suffocating wealth of the Upper East Side, merging seamlessly into the chaotic, indifferent traffic of Fifth Avenue. She watched the towering skyscrapers pass by, observing the crowded sidewalks, the tourists taking photographs, and the rushing delivery workers, feeling a strange disconnect between the world outside and the massive emotional shift happening within her chest. Her cellular phone buzzed relentlessly against the leather of her purse, vibrating with 17 consecutive text messages from Ryan. He started with arrogant commands to return immediately, shifted into frantic explanations about the banker's sudden appearance, and ultimately devolved into bitter accusations. claiming she had intentionally orchestrated the entire scene to punish him and humiliate his mother. Claire read only the final message before pressing the button to lock the screen, noting the profound selfishness in his words. He wrote about what she had done to him, never mentioning the devastation he had just inflicted upon her. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, closed her eyes, and let the rhythmic motion of the car soothe her frayed nerves. It was not a calculated act of vengeance, she realized, but rather a simple, unavoidable consequence of truth, and for the first time in nearly a decade, she felt absolutely no desire to reach out and stop Ryan from hitting the ground. Instead of directing the driver to the luxurious penthouse she had shared with Ryan, Claire asked to be dropped off at a discreet, high-end cafe nestled in the lobby of a corporate building near Wall Street. The establishment was filled with the low hum of business negotiations, the rich scent of freshly roasted coffee beans, and the clinking of ceramic cups, providing an atmosphere where no one would ask intrusive questions of a well-dressed woman sitting alone. She chose a small table tucked securely in the back corner, positioning herself with her back to the solid wall, as if she needed to relearn the basic mechanics of feeling safe in an unpredictable world. When the waitress approached, Claire requested nothing more than a simple espresso and a tall glass of sparkling water, her hands resting quietly on the dark wooden surface. The pale, untanned band of skin on her ring finger caught the soft overhead lighting, a lingering ghost of the gold ring she had worn for years. She stared at that empty space and found, much to her own surprise, that she did not miss the heavy metal or the institution it represented. What she truly mourned was the vibrant, optimistic young woman she used to be, the one who genuinely believed her endless sacrifices could somehow purchase unconditional love and loyalty from a family incapable of providing either. Back at the sprawling estate, the illusion of untouchable prosperity had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying panic. The lavish Sunday meal sat entirely forgotten on the long table, the expensive roasted duck turning cold and unappetizing, while the fine wine turned bitter in their mouths. Victoria, still hovering awkwardly near Ryan's empty chair, attempted to maintain her aura of injured pride, crossing her arms and projecting an attitude of deep offense, though her eyes darted nervously around the room. Lucille paced frantically back and forth across the priceless Persian rug, clutching the opened beige envelope to her chest, as if the thick paper had personally insulted her prestigious lineage. She aggressively questioned her son, demanding to know how he could possibly be ignorant of the fact that his own wife was the sole financial anchor, keeping their entire empire afloat. Ryan stood paralyzed near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring blankly at his phone, stammering that he knew Claire had made a few helpful introductions, but he had absolutely no idea she had pledged the entirety of her inherited assets to secure their corporate debts. Uncle Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh, mercilessly informing his nephew that, while Ryan enjoyed signing the ceremonial paperwork for the cameras, it was Claire who had quietly and consistently absorbed every single ounce of the catastrophic financial risk. At the quiet cafe, the arrival of Harper Pierce, Claire's fiercely intelligent corporate attorney, shifted the atmosphere from quiet reflection to decisive action. Harper was a formidable woman in her early 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back sharply, carrying an aura of absolute competence that demanded immediate respect. She slid into the seat opposite Claire, placed a heavy leather briefcase onto the table, and before speaking a single word about contracts, percentages, or legal liabilities, she looked Claire directly in the eyes and asked softly if Ryan had physically harmed her. Claire shook her head gently, assuring the lawyer that his violence was entirely emotional and rooted in his desperate need to dictate every aspect of her existence. Harper released a long, deep breath, nodding in quiet understanding before opening her briefcase and pulling out a pristine stack of legal documents. Claire wrapped her hands around her warm espresso cup, admitting softly that she harbored no desire to maliciously destroy the family business, as there were hundreds of innocent employees whose livelihoods depended on those doors remaining open. Harper studied her client with a mixture of professional respect and protective warmth, affirming that they would indeed protect the workers but they would immediately cease, allowing the family to exploit Claire's name, wealth, and quiet grace while treating her like an inconvenient guest at her own table. The legal strategy Harper outlined was surgically precise and completely devastating in its simplicity. The very first measure was the dispatch of a formal, legally binding notification to the investment bank, immediately freezing any further progress on the financial restructuring until the terms were independently reviewed and thoroughly renegotiated. The second, far more personal measure was drafting an ironclad injunction strictly prohibiting Ryan, Lucille, or any executive within the holding company from utilizing Claire's maiden name, or pledging her assets in any future negotiations without her explicit written consent. Harper explained each specific clause without an ounce of exaggeration, using dry, factual terminology that stripped away all the emotional manipulation the family had relied upon for years. Claire listened in profound silence, feeling as though each legal term was peeling away another layer of the deep illusions she had harbored about her marriage. She confessed to Harper that she had originally signed those guarantees because the business plan made logical sense, and she desperately wanted to protect her husband from the shame of a public bankruptcy. Harper gently pointed out that shielding an arrogant man from the natural consequences of his own severe incompetence only guaranteed that he would eventually claim the resulting survival as his own brilliant triumph. Meanwhile, within the echoing walls of the Upper East Side mansion, Lucille had swiftly shifted her tactics from panic to ruthless self-preservation. She turned her cold, calculating gaze toward Victoria, who was still trying to look relevant, and politely but lethally suggested that the current crisis was an intimate family matter, heavily implying the mistress should immediately exit the premises. Victoria's artificial smile hardened into a brittle grimace as she reminded Lucille that earlier that afternoon she had been welcomed as a permanent addition to their elite circle. Lucille did not even blink, coldly stating that many people had clearly misunderstood their respective places that afternoon, a remark that struck Victoria with the precision of a seasoned sniper. Ryan, entirely consumed by his frantic failed attempts to contact his wife, offered not a single syllable of defense for the woman he had claimed was his perfect match just an hour prior. Victoria stood frozen, a sudden flash of profound insecurity breaking through her carefully curated silk and perfume, as she realized the fairy tale she thought she had stolen was nothing more than a sinking ship. She grabbed her designer handbag and stormed out into the gardens, finally understanding that the quiet, unassuming wife she had so arrogantly mocked actually controlled the entire universe she so desperately wished to inhabit. The corporate headquarters of the family's holding company, located in a towering glass structure in Midtown Manhattan, felt noticeably colder than usual the following morning. Employees moved through the expansive marble lobby with a quiet, anxious urgency, their hushed conversations reflecting the inevitable rumors that always precede a catastrophic corporate collapse. Ryan arrived earlier than anyone else, entirely abandoning his usual impeccably tailored suit jacket, his eyes heavily shadowed by a completely sleepless night spent staring at a silent telephone. For the first time in his professional life, the receptionists and junior executives greeted him not with the customary deference owed to a powerful heir, but with a cautious, lingering curiosity, as if looking at a man who was already a ghost. He rode the private executive elevator to the top floor in total isolation, staring at his tired reflection in the polished steel doors, unable to find the confident, untouchable visionary he had always believed himself to be. Upon entering his corner office, he found 3 incredibly thick, ancient folders resting squarely in the center of his mahogany desk, placed there by Uncle Arthur before the sun had even risen. Ryan slowly opened the heavy folders, his stomach dropping as he reviewed the extensive historical records of the company's most desperate financial crises over the past several years. There was the brutal renegotiation with the overseas suppliers, the emergency credit extension for the failed commercial real estate venture, and the confidential comfort letter that had miraculously calmed a panicked foreign investor. On every single critical document, buried in the dense legal sections he routinely ignored, was an unwavering, elegant signature, Claire's maiden name, pledging her quiet power to save his fragile ego. He remembered those nights vividly. Claire arriving late from meetings she rarely discussed, quietly assuring him that her legal team had resolved the minor administrative hurdles, while he patronizingly patted her hand and returned to his golf magazines. He had always categorized her immense interventions as basic domestic support, entirely erasing her brilliance because acknowledging it would require admitting his own profound inadequacies. Touching the dried ink of her signature, a wave of pure, suffocating shame washed over him, a burning realization that his entire identity as a brilliant corporate leader was a hollow fabrication entirely subsidized by the woman he had cruelly discarded over a Sunday roast. His painful revelation was abruptly interrupted when the heavy office doors swung open, revealing Victoria marching past his protesting executive assistant. She was dressed in severe black clothing, wearing oversized dark sunglasses despite being indoors, and carrying an aggressively bright red handbag that screamed for the attention she felt she was rapidly losing. "You completely vanished on me yesterday," she accused fiercely, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal eyes that were angry rather than heartbroken, demanding an immediate explanation for his sudden emotional absence. Ryan leaned heavily against the edge of his desk, the sheer exhaustion making his voice sound remarkably hollow as he explained that his entire world was currently unraveling. Victoria crossed her arms, her voice dripping with venom as she declared that Claire was simply executing a manipulative, dramatic theater production to force him into submission, and that he needed to stop acting like a wounded animal. Ryan looked at her, truly looking at her for the very first time without the filter of his own massive ego, and stated quietly that she had willingly walked into his family's home, fully intending to participate in the public execution of his wife. Victoria lifted her chin defiantly, reminding him sharply that he was the one who had invited her, a brutal truth that temporarily silenced him. While Ryan was battling the ghosts of his own making, Lucille was attempting to deploy her traditional arsenal of emotional manipulation across town. She arrived at the sleek, minimalist secondary office space Harper had temporarily secured near Bryant Park, dressed impeccably in beige cashmere and stiff pearls, clutching a structured handbag like a protective shield. She absolutely refused the offer of fresh coffee or water, and pointedly remained standing until Claire took a seat, a subtle power play designed to establish dominance in a room she did not control. "I came here without my son," Lucille announced, her tone implying she was bestowing a massive favor. "I believed a private conversation between two civilized women might yield a vastly more productive outcome for everyone involved." Claire folded her hands, resting on the cool glass table, her voice perfectly, even as she asked who exactly this outcome was supposed to be productive for, considering the events of the previous day. Lucille's mouth tightened into a thin line as she began her rehearsed monologue, invoking the sacred legacy of the family name, the terrifying specter of the financial press, and the moral duty to protect the hundreds of innocent employees who relied on the company's stability. Throughout the entire emotional performance, Lucille deliberately avoided uttering a single word of genuine apology, completely ignoring the profound cruelty of the Sunday lunch, framing the entire situation as a minor misunderstanding that a dutiful wife should easily overlook. Claire allowed the older woman to completely exhaust her supply of guilt-inducing rhetoric before calmly reaching into a drawer and pulling out a highly detailed summary of the company's true financial exposure. "You speak of duty and legacy, yet for years you happily perpetuated the vicious lie that I was a simple, unsophisticated woman who should be eternally grateful for a seat at your table," Claire said, her voice completely devoid of anger, which made the words strike with lethal force. "You gladly consumed my wealth in the shadows to maintain your flawless facade, while simultaneously mocking my lack of extravagant jewelry in the bright light of day." Lucille's perfectly powdered face flushed a deep, uncomfortable crimson as her eyes locked onto the undeniable financial figures resting between them, realizing her traditional tactics of shame and duty held absolutely no leverage here. Claire stated with absolute finality that she was no longer a complicit participant in her own erasure, and that the era of the family utilizing her silent sacrifices to fund their unearned arrogance had officially ended. Back in Midtown, Ryan's morning steadily deteriorated as he faced a grim emergency meeting with Uncle Arthur and two senior board members in the executive conference room. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy, the digital projections on the wall clearly illustrating that without the immediate reinstatement of Claire's financial guarantee, the company would default on major loans within days. One of the directors, usually timid man who never contradicted the family, quietly pointed out that Claire was not an accessory, but the absolute foundational pillar of the entire restructuring agreement. Ryan bristled at the past tense, desperately insisting they could still fix the situation, but Arthur mercilessly cut him down, stating that the damage was permanent so long as Ryan treated it as a simple marital spat. You heard her suggestions, you saw her meetings, and you deliberately chose to view her as an annoying child playing business, all while cashing the checks her name secured, Arthur said, his voice entirely lacking sympathy. As the harsh truth settled over the room, Ryan's phone chimed with a formal email from Harper Pierce, detailing Claire's non-negotiable, stringent conditions for any future involvement, cementing the fact that the old Ryan was entirely powerless. The highly anticipated emergency board meeting was scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock the next morning in the company's grandest conference room, a massive space featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The oval mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, small porcelain coffee cups sat perfectly aligned next to crystal water glasses, and thick leather portfolios rested ominously at each designated seat. Lucille arrived first, wearing a severely tailored dark navy suit, and an expression of grim determination, followed closely by Uncle Arthur, who looked profoundly exhausted and actively avoided making eye contact with anyone. Two senior corporate directors took their seats with extreme caution, while Matthew, the anxious investment banker, sat on the far right side, flanked by a sharp-eyed legal consultant ready to scrutinize every detail. Ryan entered the room last, bypassing his usual seat of absolute authority at the head of the long table, choosing instead to stand quietly near the massive windows, gazing down at the bustling city streets. When the heavy double doors finally opened, Claire walked in accompanied by Harper, wearing a flawlessly tailored, simple white suit, radiating a quiet, unshakable authority that instantly commanded the entire room. Unlike the suffocating Sunday lunch, where everyone expected her to shrink into the background, today the entire room held its collective breath, acutely aware that the woman they had routinely underestimated now held their collective professional survival in her hands. Matthew opened the proceedings with rehearsed professional caution, carefully outlining the dire mathematical realities of the restructuring plan, emphasizing that the bank required total continuity of the previously established financial guarantees. Harper then smoothly took control of the narrative, distributing copies of a dense, uncompromising legal document that outlined Claire's strict, non-negotiable conditions for preventing the company's immediate collapse into bankruptcy. My client harbors no desire to intentionally cause the destruction of this enterprise, Harper stated, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. However, she will absolutely not permit her personal assets, her sterling reputation, or her signature to be exploited without comprehensive formal recognition, total transparency, and rigorous mechanisms of external control. Lucille aggressively flipped through the pages, her face contorting with sheer indignation as she read the demands for independent external audits and the permanent removal of her own informal financial influence. "This is an absolute public humiliation," Lucille hissed across the table, her hands trembling slightly as she glared at her daughter-in-law, accusing Claire of intentionally trying to destroy their prestigious social standing. Claire did not look away, her gaze steady and devastatingly calm as she replied, "Humiliation is orchestrating a grand Sunday lunch specifically to present another woman as vastly more adequate, only to demand my financial salvation the very next morning." Before Lucille could formulate a suitably venomous response, the heavy doors of the conference room burst open, revealing Victoria, who had somehow bypassed security, dressed in a dramatically inappropriate dark green cocktail dress. She marched into the room with desperate, aggressive energy, entirely misjudging the solemn corporate atmosphere, determined to reclaim her position in a narrative that had already expelled her. "You think you can just march in here and force everyone to bow to your demands?" Victoria shouted, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Claire, her voice echoing shrilly against the pristine glass walls. "You are deliberately trying to paint Ryan as a terrible villain just because you are bitter, desperately trying to buy the love and respect you clearly could never earn naturally." The senior directors shifted extremely uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, utterly horrified by the dramatic intrusion, while Lucille closed her eyes in pure mortification, realizing Victoria was single-handedly destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity the family had left. Before Claire or Harper could utter a single word in defense, Ryan finally moved away from the window, his voice cutting through the chaotic noise with surprising heavy authority. "That is absolutely enough, Victoria," he commanded, stepping forward and placing himself physically between the desperate woman and the long conference table. Victoria looked at him with profound shock, fully expecting him to join her attack, asking incredulously if he was actually going to defend the wife, who was currently holding his entire legacy hostage. Ryan took a deep breath, looking around the room at the board members, his mother, and finally resting his gaze on Claire, his expression stripped of all its former arrogant vanity. "I am absolutely done allowing you, or anyone else, to fiercely defend the pathetic lies I fabricated simply to protect my own massive, fragile ego," he confessed loudly, the sheer honesty of his words freezing the entire room in place. He turned fully toward the stunned audience, his voice dropping into a register of profound, painful sincerity that no one in that building had ever heard from him before. "I announced on Sunday that Victoria was vastly more suited to my elevated world. But the pathetic truth is that I was terrified of the real world, utterly terrified of admitting my own profound failures. I actively chose to label my wife as overly simple and socially awkward because acknowledging her massive competence would require me to face my own crippling dependence on her brilliance." Victoria's face drained of all its color as the brutal reality set in. The man she had banked her entire social future upon was publicly immolating his own false image, leaving her with absolutely nothing to cling to. Recognizing her total defeat, Victoria sneered that they thoroughly deserved their impending misery, turned sharply on her high heels, and stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her with an echoing finality. Lucille made one last, desperate attempt to leverage guilt, begging Claire to ignore the emotional drama and think of the hard-working families who depended on their paychecks. Claire firmly placed her hands flat on the polished wood, responding that it was precisely because of those vulnerable families that she was establishing ironclad boundaries, preventing the family's emotional chaos from ever threatening their livelihoods again. Defeated by undeniable logic and overwhelming legal pressure, the board members swiftly signed the preliminary agreements, officially stripping Ryan of his unilateral decision-making power and implementing every single one of Harper's rigorous stipulations. Lucille signed the heavy documents with an incredibly stiff hand, her posture rigid, completely unable to meet the eyes of the daughter-in-law she had spent nearly a decade trying to systematically diminish. When the grueling meeting officially concluded, there were no triumphant smiles, no celebratory handshakes, and absolutely no cinematic moments of miraculous forgiveness. There was only the heavy, exhausted relief of a catastrophe narrowly averted through painful honesty. As the room slowly emptied, Ryan caught up to Claire in the quiet, carpeted hallway near the executive elevators, maintaining a highly respectful physical distance, thoroughly understanding that he no longer possessed the right to simply enter her personal space. He reached into his pocket and handed her a carefully folded, yellowing memorandum from years prior, the exact document where he had maliciously ordered the board to erase her contributions, stating that he wanted her to have the undeniable proof of his past cruelty. He did not ask for a second chance, nor did he beg for her sudden forgiveness. He simply stepped back as the elevator doors closed, leaving him alone to finally begin the excruciating work of building a character entirely from scratch. Over the course of the next 3 highly transformative months, the corporate culture at the family enterprise shifted radically, shedding its toxic layers of nepotism and implementing a rigid structure of actual accountability. The mandatory independent audit ruthlessly exposed years of incredibly poor strategic decisions, wildly inflated executive expense accounts, and numerous vanity projects that had drained the company's capital simply to flatter Ryan's public image. Lucille was quietly but firmly removed from all informal financial decision-making processes, her once absolute authority reduced to merely attending purely ceremonial social functions where her influence was entirely cosmetic. To the profound shock of the senior directors and industry insiders, Ryan accepted his drastically reduced role without a single public complaint or private temper tantrum, focusing intensely on genuinely learning the fundamental mechanics of the business he had previously only pretended to master. Victoria, meanwhile, vanished completely from the elite charity galas and exclusive restaurant openings, discovering the hard way that borrowed elegance and vicious ambition provide absolutely no permanent security when the source of power dries up. The absence of the old, arrogant regime allowed the hard-working employees to finally breathe easily, fully realizing that the company was no longer being steered by the erratic, emotional whims of a deeply insecure family. During the company's restructuring, Claire built a completely new life away from the Upper East Side mansion. She moved into a bright apartment on the Upper West Side and, alongside Harper, launched an investment fund supporting female entrepreneurs. For the first time, she focused her intelligence and resources on creating a legacy of her own. Meanwhile, Ryan respected her boundaries, communicating only through brief, professional channels and never attempting to manipulate her into returning. Months later, they met in Central Park, so he could deliver the final documents separating her from his past mistakes and return her wedding band. In a rare moment of honesty, Claire admitted that she had spent years believing her value depended on constantly rescuing him, while Ryan confessed that he had taken advantage of that fear. When he cautiously asked whether there might someday be a chance to know her again, she made it clear that any future possibility would require years of genuine accountability, consistent respect, and real change. She then walked away, carrying her freedom with her. Several months later, Claire received an unexpected invitation from Uncle Arthur to attend a corporate luncheon celebrating the company's successful restructuring. She accepted not out of loyalty to the family, but to honor the employees whose jobs had been protected by the decisions she had fought to enforce. The event reflected a transformed culture, free from the old hierarchy and hostility. Ryan greeted her respectfully and gave her space, while Lucille offered a long-overdue apology for undervaluing her. During the luncheon, a veteran employee praised the leadership changes that had saved the company and the families who depended on it. Claire realized that refusing to blindly support the company's failures had ultimately been an act of responsibility and compassion. Later, Ryan publicly acknowledged that the company's survival was due not to his own brilliance, but to the firm boundaries Claire had imposed, admitting that true leadership begins with confronting uncomfortable truths. After the event, Claire and Ryan shared a quiet moment on a balcony overlooking Manhattan. There was no bitterness, no pressure, and no attempt to force reconciliation. Claire admitted she still did not know what the future might hold, and Ryan assured her he was willing to wait without expectations. As she left, she felt not like a victim escaping the past, but like a confident woman fully in control of her own life. Their journey revealed that true strength lies in walking away from relationships that demand the sacrifice of one's identity. Love should never require endless suffering or self-erasure. Real belonging begins when we stop seeking permission to exist and finally claim the respect, dignity, and space we deserve.